Daniel Reyes thought he was giving his wife the best surprise of her life. He didn't know that in the next 4 minutes, standing under the fluorescent glare of an airport arrivals hall, he would learn who she really was. Within a single ringtone, a marriage built over 11 years would crack straight down the middle. If stories about quiet dignity and earned justice are the kind you come back for, take a second to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now, let me take you to Terminal 2, where a man in a gray coat is holding 2 bags and a bouquet of white lilies, and does not yet know his life is about to change. Daniel had planned it for weeks. His wife, Vanessa, had been traveling for work more and more over the past year. Regional conferences, client dinners, 3-day trips that stretched into 5. She was a partner at a mid-sized marketing firm, or so the story went, and she'd told him this particular trip to Chicago was the most important of her career, a make-or-break pitch. When she landed back home that Friday evening, she expected an empty apartment and a cold dinner. Instead, Daniel had left work early, bought her favorite flowers, and driven to the airport to meet her at the gate like they were young again. He stood near the arrivals barrier holding her spare carry-on, the small tan leather bag she always forgot things in, the one she'd asked him to bring so she could swap out her heavier suitcase. That was the excuse. Anyway, she'd called him that morning, sweet and rushed, asking him to bring the tan bag and to please not be late. He'd been so pleased she wanted him there that he hadn't questioned it. Daniel was 39 years old, an architect by training, though most people who met him assumed he was something less consequential. He had that quality, soft-spoken, unhurried, the kind of man who let others fill the silence. He wore off-the-rack coats and drove a 6-year-old sedan, and when people at Vanessa's firm parties learned what he did, they usually nodded politely and drifted toward someone more interesting. Vanessa had drifted too, over the years. He'd noticed. He'd told himself it was work stress. What almost none of them knew was that Daniel Reyes had, 4 years earlier, sold his stake in a design and development firm he'd co-founded in his 20s. The buyout had been quiet, structured over installments, and Daniel had never once brought it up at a dinner party. He kept working because he loved the work, not because he needed the money. He'd let Vanessa believe they lived comfortably but modestly because that was how he preferred to live, and because, if he was honest with himself now, standing there with lilies because some part of him had wanted to see who valued him without the number attached. He was thinking none of this at the moment. He was watching the automatic doors and rehearsing her name. The flight had landed. Passengers began spilling out in that tired, disoriented stream, dragging suitcases, scanning the crowd. Daniel straightened, and then, from inside the tan leather bag hanging over his shoulder, Vanessa's bag, a phone began to ring. He froze. She'd left her phone in the bag. Of course she had. She was always forgetting it, and she'd handed him the bag that morning, half-packed. The ringing was insistent, muffled by leather and fabric. Daniel's first instinct was simple and innocent. Answer it. Tell whoever it was that she just landed. Hand it to her when she appeared. He unzipped the bag, pushed aside a scarf, and pulled out the phone. The screen was lit. The contact name glowed up at him in clean white letters. It said, Husband Daniel stood very still. He was holding the phone. The phone was calling him. No, it was receiving a call from someone saved in Vanessa's phone as husband. And Daniel was her husband. He was standing right there. He had not called her. His thumb hovered. The phone rang a second time, a third. And then, because the human mind reaches for the ordinary explanation before it reaches for the terrible one, he thought, it's a joke, it's a mistake, it's a duplicate contact. He swiped to answer, and out of some reflex he didn't fully understand, he did not speak. He just listened. A man's voice came through, low and easy, and familiar in a way that made Daniel's stomach fold. Hey, are you off the plane? I'm circling arrivals. I couldn't find parking. Did you tell your... A small laugh? Did you tell the placeholder you'd be late? I don't want him hanging around the airport all night, babe. The placeholder. Daniel did not hang up. He didn't say a word. He held the phone to his ear and stared at the doors, and in that suspended second, the whole architecture of his marriage rearranged itself into a shape he could suddenly, horribly read. The trips, the forgotten phones, the dinners, the way she'd stopped looking at him across the table. Not stress, not distance. A second man, saved in her phone under the same title Daniel wore. He was still holding the lilies. Through the doors, he saw her, Vanessa, 36, tall, immaculate, even after a flight, scanning the crowd. Not for Daniel, he understood now, but past him. She was searching for someone else. And she had not yet seen that her husband, her actual husband, was standing there with her phone pressed to his ear and her lover's voice still murmuring into it. Daniel lowered the phone. He didn't end the call. He just let it hang there, live at his side, and he watched his wife walk toward him with a smile that was, he realized, entirely rehearsed. "There you are," Vanessa said, arriving in a cloud of perfume and airport exhaustion. She kissed his cheek, distracted, already reaching. "Oh, you brought the flowers. That's sweet. Did my phone ring? I've been trying to. I need my phone, Dan." "It rang," Daniel said. His voice was perfectly level. He heard it as if from a distance, calm, architectural, load-bearing. Someone called, "Who?" She held out her hand. "Your husband," Daniel said. For one full second, Vanessa's face did nothing, and then it did everything. Persian. The color left it in a slow tide. Her outstretched hand curled, halfway closed. She looked, for the first time in what Daniel realized had been years, directly into his eyes. And what he saw there was not guilt yet, only calculation. The rapid, frantic arithmetic of a person trying to figure out exactly how much had been overheard. "That's," she started. Daniel turned the screen toward her, where the call was still running, the seconds ticking upward. 2 minutes and 11 seconds now. "Husband," the screen said, and faintly, from the small speaker, still audible in the quiet pocket between them, the man's voice rose again, tinny and impatient. "Babe, you there? Hello?" Vanessa snatched the phone. She ended the call with a shaking thumb, and Daniel simply watched her, holding the flowers she had told him were sweet, standing in the middle of an airport, full of people, reuniting with the ones they love. "It's not what you think," she said, the oldest sentence in the world. Daniel didn't shout. That was, later, what unsettled her most. He didn't grab her arm, or raise his voice, or make a scene for the strangers streaming past. He looked at her, the way he looked at a flawed blueprint, seeing the whole structure, the place where the load had been wrongly distributed, the crack that had always been there beneath the paint. "How long?" he asked. Not a question, really. A measurement. "Daniel, how long has he been in your phone as that word?" She said nothing, which was its own answer. And in the silence he set the lilies down on the edge of a luggage cart, gently, without drama, and picked up the tan leather bag he'd carried in for her like a fool. "Your bag," he said, and held it out. "You forgot it this morning, Polly. You were in a hurry to get to your pitch." Her lower lip trembled. "Let me explain, in the car." "There's no car," Daniel said. "Not the one you're thinking of." And he turned and walked toward the exit, and he did not look back to see whether she followed, though he heard her heels striking the tile behind him, quick and uneven. A woman who had spent 11 years being certain of exactly where her husband stood, and now could not find him at all. Out at the curb, a black car idled. A man stepped out of it, mid-40s, expensive jacket, the confident posture of someone used to being the most successful person in a room. He raised a hand toward Vanessa with a grin that curdled the instant he registered the man walking beside her. This then was the voice. This was husband, the second entry. His name, Daniel would learn shortly, was Marcus Hale, and he ran a regional sales operation and believed deeply in his own charm. "Van," Marcus said, uncertain. Everything okay?" And here was the thing Daniel understood in that moment, standing on the curb with the evening traffic hissing past. Both of them, Vanessa and Marcus, looked at him and saw the placeholder, the soft coat, the old sedan somewhere in the lot. The architect who nodded politely at parties. They had built their entire secret on the assumption that Daniel was a small man in a small life who would, when the truth arrived, crumble quietly and be grateful for whatever they left him. "You must be Marcus," Daniel said, and extended his hand with genuine, terrible courtesy. Marcus, on instinct, shook it. "I'm the other one, the one she couldn't tell apart from you in her contacts." Marcus dropped the hand. Vanessa said, "Daniel, please, in private, you wanted me at the airport tonight." Daniel said to her, still calm, still measuring, "You had me drive here, carry your bag, buy flowers. Why? So I'd think everything was normal. So the story stayed intact one more week. But you got careless, Vanessa. You handed the placeholder your phone." He paused. "That's the problem with treating someone as furniture. You stop watching what you leave sitting on them." He got in his own car and drove home alone that night, and he did not weep, and he did not call anyone, and he did not send a single furious message. Instead, Daniel Reyes did what he had always done best. He sat at his kitchen table and he thought, and he began, quietly, methodically, to understand the true dimensions of what he was standing in, because here was what Vanessa didn't know. In the days that followed, Daniel pulled the file he kept in a locked drawer, the one with the paperwork from the buyout 4 years earlier, the accounts she'd never asked about because she'd assumed there was nothing to ask about. He owned their apartment outright, not mortgaged, owned, purchased quietly, with proceeds she'd never seen enter their joint account, because it never had. The comfortable but modest life had been a set. And Vanessa, in her hunger for a man who wore his success loudly, had walked past the man who carried his in silence. He met with a lawyer that Monday. Not out of vengeance, Daniel found, examining himself carefully, that he did not want to destroy her, only to stop being lied to. But the facts were the facts, and the facts protected him. Their prenuptial agreement, which Vanessa had signed 11 years ago, barely reading it, laughing that they'd never need it, contained a fidelity clause and a full separation of premarital and business assets. Daniel's firm equity and everything it had become had never been marital property. She had signed away any claim to it before she'd ever thought it worth having. The lawyer, a calm woman named Priya Nair, read the documents twice and set them down. "You understand what this means," she said. "In the event of divorce on these grounds, with this agreement, your wife leaves with what she brought in and what she personally earned. The apartment, the assets from the sale, none of it is divisible. She has essentially no claim." She looked at him carefully. "I have to ask, are you certain that's what you want? Some clients, in the moment, want more, want to hurt. It rarely ends well." "I don't want to hurt her," Daniel said, and he meant it. "I want the truth on paper. I've spent 11 years having it hidden from me. I'd just like it to sit in the sunlight for once." There was, of course, the matter of how Vanessa had been living. She'd assumed a lifestyle her own salary couldn't quite carry, and she'd been carrying it partly on Daniel's steady contributions and partly, it now turned out, on Marcus's generosity, a man who believed he was rescuing her from a dull marriage to a dull man. The irony that Daniel could have bought and sold Marcus several times over sat quietly, and Daniel did not touch it. He simply let it exist. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not the explosion Vanessa had braced for. Daniel invited her to the apartment on a Sunday, and Priya was there, and a neat stack of documents sat on the table where the lilies had never made it. Vanessa arrived defensive, then heard the calm in the room and grew frightened by it. "I'm not going to yell," Daniel told her. "I'm not going to tell your firm or Marcus's wife. Yes, I know about her, you didn't, or your mother, or our friends. Seth, that's not the kind of man I am, and I think you always knew that, and I think you counted on it." He slid the papers across. "This is the prenuptial agreement you signed. This is the ownership documentation for this apartment. This is the record of the business sale from 4 years ago. I never lied to you, Vanessa. I just never announced myself. You had every chance, for 11 years, to be curious about the man you married. You spent it being curious about someone else. She read. He watched the numbers reach her, the size of what she'd walked past, the totality of what she had no claim to. And to her credit, or perhaps simply to her exhaustion, she did not rage. She set the papers down and said very quietly, I called you the placeholder to him. Those exact words, I heard, Daniel said. The call ran 2 minutes and 11 seconds. I heard all of it. Why did you carry my bag all the way to the gate then, after you knew? Why not just leave? Daniel considered this. Because, he said, I wanted, one last time, to be exactly the man you thought I was. Small, quiet, carrying your things. I wanted to see it clearly before I set it down. The divorce was uncontested because there was nothing to contest. Vanessa moved out within the month, taking what was hers, which was less than she'd told the world she had. Marcus, it turned out, was significantly less generous once the affair no longer had the thrill of secrecy attached to it, and once his own wife found out. Not from Daniel, who kept his word, but from the ordinary gravity of lies, which always find their own way to the ground. The black car stopped circling the airport. Daniel kept the apartment. He kept the lilies out of his life for a while, and then, one spring, he bought a bunch for the kitchen table simply because he liked them and reclaimed them from the memory. He went back to his firm, to the work he'd always loved, and he stopped pretending to be smaller than he was, not to boast, but because he finally understood that hiding your worth so people can prove they love you anyway is just another way of letting them off the hook. Love that requires you to be diminished isn't love, it's storage. Months later, a former colleague set him up to dinner with a woman named Elena, an engineer who asked him, on the first evening, what he actually did, and listened to the whole answer, and then asked a follow-up question that showed she'd been listening. That was all. That was everything. Daniel realized sitting across from her that he'd spent over a decade mistaking being needed for being seen. Here is what that airport taught a soft-spoken man in a gray coat. The people who reduce you to a placeholder are always in the end telling you about the size of their own vision, not yours. You cannot make someone value what they've decided not to look at. And your worth was never up for their vote, existed quietly, whether or not anyone ever called it by its right name. Daniel didn't win because he was secretly rich. He won because when the truth finally rang, he answered it and he didn't flinch. And he refused to become cruel on his way out of a cruelty. So, let me leave you with the question I've been carrying since the moment that phone lit up in that leather bag. Have you ever been underestimated by the very person who was supposed to know you best? And what did it teach you about your own worth? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and I think this one will matter to a lot of you. If this story moved you, leave a like so more people find it, and subscribe, because I have another one coming that begins with a locked door and a name no one expected to hear. Wherever you're watching from tonight, thank you for staying to the end. Take care of the ones who see you, and never shrink yourself small enough to fit inside someone else's blind spot.